Under the scorching 140-degree Fahrenheit heat of Dusty Creek, Texas, an 8-year-old boy with only one arm wandered the desert in search of water. Among the cracked sands, he stumbled upon a tortured police officer, hands bound, left to die, and his K-9 partner, Max, barely clinging to life beside him. A child the world had deemed useless chose to do what no one else would: save two strangers. No one knew that moment would become the spark that revealed the cruelty hidden beneath the surface. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And follow us by subscribing to Healing with Max, so you never miss a story about the kind of courage that doesn't need to be loud, and the kind of loyalty that never lets go. Now take a deep breath, relax, and join us on this journey, where mercy and faith become the truest form of justice. The noon sun over Dusty Creek was not the kind that simply burned. It punished. It flattened everything beneath it, turning the air into a living, writhing thing that shimmered and moaned across the cracked highway. The tar split like old skin, and the cicadas screamed as if they too were begging for mercy. Nothing moved except the distant breath of dust devils twisting across the plain. This was a town that had long ago surrendered to summer, where even the wind had learned to crawl. From that horizon of white heat came a figure, small, slow, and stubborn. An 8-year-old boy trudged along the shoulder of the road, his thin body casting a shadow as fragile as a thread. His name was Samuel Green, though no one had called it in days. His left arm swung naturally, while his right sleeve, empty and knotted, brushed against his side like a ghost that refused to leave. His hair, the color of dried wheat, clung to his forehead in sweaty clumps, and his freckled face carried the stillness of someone who had already learned what hunger, loss, and silence could do to a child. The shoes on his feet were 2 sizes too big, the kind you find in donation bins, worn thin and cracked. In his good hand, he held a dented metal canteen that rattled faintly, empty except for hope. He had been walking since dawn, chasing a rumor that an old gas station still had water locked somewhere in its pipes. The heat was the kind that made time blur. His breath came dry and raspy, but his gaze stayed forward, alert and deliberate. Samuel was the kind of boy the world often forgot, the kind who kept moving because stopping meant remembering. As he crested a small rise in the highway, something glinted through the weeds. At first, he thought it was another mirage, one of those cruel tricks of the desert that promised salvation only to vanish when you got close enough to touch. But this shimmer didn't fade. It pulsed, metallic, deliberate, out of place. He squinted, raising a hand to shade his eyes. Then, through the warped air, the shape began to form. A man slumped against a utility pole, his head bowed unnaturally low, one arm twisted behind him. Next to the man lay a dark mass, still but not lifeless. For a moment, the boy stood perfectly still. The world seemed to stop breathing. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the desert. Soft, broken, half human, half animal. A low whimper carried through the heat. He ran, the ground radiated fire through the soles of his shoes. His lungs burned, the canteen clanged against his side, but the fear pushing him forward was sharper than the pain. As he neared, the scene came into focus. The man's uniform dark with sweat, streaked with dust and something darker. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, the other glazed and lost between life and nothing. The badge on his chest caught the sun and threw it back like a signal flare. Officer Callan Hayes, Dusty Creek PD. Beside him, a German shepherd lay, half on its side, its ribs moving unevenly, fur matted with blood and dirt. The dog's tongue hung dry from its mouth, cracked and pale. There was a leash still looped around its collar, the nylon frayed as though someone had cut it in haste. Its eyes, brown and glassy but alive, found Samuel immediately. The boy knelt beside them, the smell of sweat, metal, and asphalt burning his nose. His hands shook as he lifted the canteen. He knew there wasn't much, barely a swallow, but he tilted it toward the officer's mouth anyway. The water slid past cracked lips, tracing a line through the dust on the man's face before disappearing. A faint sound escaped him, a breath, maybe a word. Samuel leaned closer, listening. Nothing. He turned to the dog, unscrewed the cap again, and poured a few drops into his small palm. The German shepherd's tongue brushed against his skin, rough, desperate, grateful. Up close, Samuel could see the creature's every detail. The thick tan and black coat faded by sun, the faint gray at the muzzle that spoke of age, the powerful shoulders trembling from exhaustion. The name tag on its collar read simply, Max. There was intelligence behind those fading eyes, something that made the boy's throat tighten. He had seen that same kind of gaze once before, on the night the fire took everything, when his father had carried him out of the smoke, only to vanish in the collapse. Samuel blinked away the memory. The air wavered, blinding. The smell of scorched metal filled his lungs. He had never seen death this close, yet something deep inside him knew it was coming if he didn't act. He looked around. The horizon stretched empty. No cars, no sound, but the hiss of insects. The asphalt shimmered like liquid. He pressed his hand against the officer's chest, warm but frighteningly still. The boy swallowed hard. "Hold on," he whispered, though the words were dry as dust. He glanced toward the sky, squinting through the glare. A vulture circled far off, just a dark dot turning slow against the white blaze. The world felt enormous and cruel. He shifted back to the man, brushing the sweat from his brow with the edge of his sleeve. The badge gleamed again, the letters blurred under the sun. Hayes. He didn't know what a police officer was supposed to look like up close, but this one looked human. Too human. His jaw slack, his uniform scorched by the same heat that had turned Samuel's skin raw. Max let out a soft whine, then rested his muzzle against the man's boot as though refusing to leave him. The gesture made Samuel's chest ache. He tore a scrap of his shirt and dabbed at the dog's muzzle, trying to cool it. The silence deepened until even the cicadas seemed to tire. The horizon shimmered, endless and merciless. Samuel sat there for what felt like forever, his small shadow trembling in the sun. And then, just as his mind began to drift into the heavy lull of heat, the sound came. A faint, electrical crackle. He looked down, startled. The man's radio, clipped crookedly to his shoulder, had flickered once, barely audible but alive. The boy stared at it, unsure if he'd imagined the noise. A second crackle followed, weak but real, carrying a single broken word before fading into static. The desert gave no answer. The wind didn't move. Yet in that silence, something had changed. A pulse, a signal, a heartbeat the world had almost buried. Samuel glanced from the radio to the faces before him, the officer, the dog, and for the first time that day, he felt something like a promise stirring inside him. It wasn't courage exactly. It was smaller, quieter. A belief that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't arrived too late. The light around them shimmered, turning every edge to fire. The boy lifted his head, eyes narrowed against the glare. The air tasted of copper and dust. His hand, trembling, reached toward the radio. It crackled again. And somewhere, miles away, inside a dim sheriff's office where the walls hummed with the hum of old machines, a single red light began to blink. The desert stayed silent, but mercy had just taken its first breath. The air had turned thick, the kind that swallowed every breath before it reached the lungs. The heat did not fade. It only pressed harder, as if daylight itself had decided to judge what still struggled beneath it. Samuel worked in silence, his small frame moving among the debris scattered near the utility pole. He gathered splintered boards and a few half-burned branches, dragging them into a rough triangle over the bodies of the fallen. His shelter wasn't much, but it stood between the sun and those who could no longer stand for themselves. He tore a strip from the hem of his shirt and wiped the officer's forehead, the fabric darkening with sweat. Callan Hayes barely stirred, his lips twitching as though caught between a prayer and a fevered dream. Max lay nearby, chest lifting in small, stubborn gasps, his fur hot as metal left too long on the fire. Samuel ran his fingers through the coarse hair, feeling each tremor beneath the skin, the warmth of a body refusing to give up. The boy's mind wandered for a heartbeat, to another heat, another summer long ago, when his father's voice still lived in the air. "Courage isn't loud," he had said, while lifting Samuel from the rubble of their burned home. "It's what you do when no one is watching." Those words drifted now like an echo across the scorched plain, steadying his hands even as fear pressed heavy against his ribs. The radio on the officer's shoulder sputtered again, static first, then fragments of sound breaking like pebbles tossed in water. "Unit 45, respond!" The voice crackled, then faded. Callan's fingers moved, weak and trembling, searching for the radio but never reaching it. Samuel stared, heart pounding, then leaned forward and pressed the button with his left hand, his thumb slick with sweat. The hiss turned into a voice, female, calm but frayed at the edges. "This is Sheriff Beckett. Identify." Samuel froze. The words were clear, real, but he didn't know how to answer. His throat burned from thirst, his tongue stuck to his teeth. "Man." "Hurt." "Need help," he managed, the words rasping like paper tearing. There was a sharp crackle, then silence. He waited, staring at the lifeless radio, his hand still on the button. For a long moment, nothing came. Then somewhere far away, in a county office that smelled of dust and coffee gone cold, a woman named Sheriff Nora Beckett straightened from her desk. She was in her late 40s, tall and spare, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled into a tight braid. Her uniform hung crisp but tired on her shoulders, the badge dull from years of wiping. When the broken transmission came through, her heart clenched before her mind caught up. Unit 45, Callan Hayes. She remembered his first day, the rookie who had brought her black coffee instead of sugar just to see her frown. And she remembered her son, gone 10 years, the one who had never made it home from the war. The same ache bloomed again, deep and familiar. Without a word, she grabbed her hat, stepped into the blistering sunlight, and started the patrol car. The radio hissed again as the wheels spun up dust. "Hang on, Callan," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. Then louder into the mic. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Beckett. I'm heading south of the old quarry road. Possible officer down." Back in the desert, Samuel didn't know that help had already begun to move. He only knew the silence had grown thicker. He turned toward Max, whose ears flicked once, nose twitching toward the horizon. The dog shifted, pressing against the rough ground as if testing his strength. Easy, Samuel murmured, though the word came out as a breath more than a sound. Max ignored him, muscles coiling beneath his coat. His eyes were fixed on something Samuel couldn't yet see. The boy squinted past the wavering air. At first all he saw was light, the endless shimmer of heat mirages rolling like ghosts across the asphalt. Then, faint and low, came another sound, the steady hum of an engine. His heart leapt. Rescue, he thought. Maybe the woman on the radio had heard. Maybe they were coming already. He rose to his knees, shielding his eyes, and watched as the noise grew louder, taking shape in the distance. A dark blur crested the ridge, sunlight glinting off its hood. Dust trailed behind it like smoke. Max's growl started deep in his throat, a low, vibrating warning that made the air itself feel tighter. Samuel's stomach sank. He glanced back at the officer, then again at the approaching vehicle. The truck rolled closer, its tires biting into the gravel. The boy could see it now. Large, heavy, the kind used for hauling rather than patrol. Its windows were tinted black, the license plate half covered in dirt. No sirens, no markings, no mercy. Samuel's pulse hammered in his neck. He took a half step back toward the officer, instinctively placing himself between the strangers and the bodies on the ground. Max's growl deepened, a trembling rumble that carried both exhaustion and defiance. The boy reached out, touching the dog's neck. "Stay quiet," he whispered. But Max didn't lower his head. His gaze stayed locked on the oncoming shape, every muscle alive again with purpose. The truck slowed, dust swirling around its tires. Its engine purred softly now, like something patient. Then it stopped, 20 yards away. The driver's door clicked open, and Samuel, standing in the cruel light of noon, felt the air around him shift, the kind of silence that comes before the next storm. The air hung still around the road, a trembling silence stretched so thin it could tear with the smallest sound. Then came the thud of boots against gravel, slow and deliberate. Two men stepped out of the dust, their faces burned hard by years of sun and sin. Their movements carried that ease of men who had done wrong long enough to forget it was wrong. One, shorter, broad across the shoulders, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist and spat into the dirt. The other, taller and lean like a blade, let the sunlight strike his pale eyes until they looked almost colorless. He was called Mike Devon, and even the heat seemed to step aside for him. The shorter man laughed when he spotted Samuel. It wasn't joy. It was disbelief shaped into a cruel smile. "Well, look at that," he muttered, his voice dry and coarse. "Didn't think we'd get a witness this small." He nudged the dust with his boot, glancing at the officer slumped by the pole. "Guess we didn't finish the job after all." His tone was almost lazy, but the words made the air colder. Samuel couldn't move. Every nerve in his body screamed to run, to hide, to vanish into the scorched horizon. But fear rooted him in place. The pistol glinted in Devon's hand as he stepped closer, and in that moment, something inside the boy's chest began to break apart, until a sound tore through the stillness, deep and raw. It was Max. The German shepherd dragged himself upright, trembling with pain, yet steady as stone. His coat was streaked with dust and blood, his ribs visible with every strained breath. The snarl that rose from him wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind that came from memory. He stepped between the boy and the men, his stance uneven yet unyielding, one paw dragging slightly, as if the earth itself tried to hold him back. Devon paused, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Easy, Mutt," he said, but his voice faltered as Max's growl deepened. Somewhere within that battered body, the ghost of training returned, the old instincts of a K9 protector rising like a tide. His ears tilted forward, his eyes, those deep amber eyes, fixed on the gun, on the man who dared aim at his boy. Devon smirked, but there was a crack in it now, a flicker of hesitation that hadn't been there before. He cocked the pistol anyway. "Let's see how much bark you've got left." The shot came sharp and sudden, exploding into the dirt inches from Max's paws. Dust leapt up like a scream, and the echo rolled down the valley, crashing against the silence that followed. Samuel flinched, but didn't look away. Max didn't either. His growl turned lower, steadier, vibrating through the ground until it sounded almost human, a sound born not of anger, but of promise. Devon spat again, shaking his head. Stupid animal. He raised the gun higher, then froze. From somewhere far off, faint but unmistakable, came the cry of a siren. It wavered like a ghost through the heat. First distant, then growing clearer, stronger, the voice of law returning to a place that had forgotten it. Devon's jaw tightened. The shorter man cursed, glancing over his shoulder. "You said no one was out here." "Not today," Devon growled. He lowered the gun, eyes sweeping the scene one last time. The boy, the dog, the unconscious officer beneath the crooked shelter. "We're done here." They moved fast, practiced. Devon kicked a cloud of dust over their footprints while his partner stomped out the tire marks near the pole. Within seconds, they were back in the truck, the engine roaring to life with a metallic cough. Samuel's hand reached out instinctively, shielding his face as the wind and grit struck him. The smell of exhaust and burned oil filled his throat. Max stood his ground until the vehicle disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did his legs tremble. He sank down slowly, muzzle pressed into the dirt, breath shaking. The boy fell to his knees beside him, tears carving clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. His left hand, his only one, rested on Max's neck, feeling the faint, stuttering rhythm of life beneath the skin. "It's okay," he whispered, though his voice was breaking. "They're gone." But the truth clung like heat. The world had enemies for every kind heart it made. He didn't understand cruelty, not really, but he understood this much. Goodness always had to fight harder to stay alive. He wiped his face with the back of his arm and looked toward the road. The horizon rippled in waves of gold and white. For a moment, he thought he saw movement again, but this time, the sound that followed was different, louder, real. Tires against gravel. He staggered to his feet, blinking through the glare, and then saw it. A white patrol truck cresting the hill, siren wailing, its lights strobing weakly against the glare of the sun. It skidded as it turned off the highway, dust spiraling up behind it like a storm breaking loose. Sheriff Nora Beckett was behind the wheel, her jaw set hard, one hand gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat louder than the siren she'd left running. The world outside blurred with speed and sunlight, but her focus was sharp as the horizon, searching, scanning, praying she wasn't too late. As she neared the utility pole, the figures came into view. A boy, small and thin, kneeling in the dirt beside a dark shape that moved only barely. For a heartbeat, Nora forgot to breathe. She slammed the brakes, the truck jerking to a stop, and stepped out into the heavy silence that followed. The air smelled of dust, gunpowder, and the faint trace of smoke from tires long gone. She took one step forward, then another, her boots crunching softly. The boy turned toward her, his face streaked with sweat and ash, his expression caught between fear and exhaustion. The dog beside him lifted its head weakly, eyes half closed, yet still watchful. Something inside the sheriff cracked. For a brief, aching moment, the scene before her wasn't just a wounded child and a dying K9. It was memory. Her son, 10 years gone, kneeling in the same heat, the same light, the same defiance. The desert hadn't changed. Only time had. Her voice faltered when she spoke, almost a whisper swallowed by the wind. "Dear God." And as the siren wound down to silence, the Texas sun glared mercilessly above, shining on the boy, the dog, and the woman who had just found the pieces of her past waiting for her in the dust. The storm had come without warning, breaking the desert's long cruelty like a glass shattering in slow motion. Rain hissed against the hospital windows, tracing silver veins down the glass. Inside, the lights were dim and humming, turning every reflection into something softer than truth. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, mixed with the faint metallic tang of thunder still echoing across the plains. Officer Callan Hayes lay on the nearest bed, his skin the color of parchment, his chest lifting in slow, stubborn rhythm. The machines beside him clicked and whispered, as if trying to remind his heart to keep going. His badge, cleaned and polished by someone's careful hand, rested on the bedside table. At the foot of the bed, Max slept curled into himself, his hind leg bandaged, twitching faintly as though running through dreams only he could see. Every so often, his ears flicked at the sound of distant thunder, then settled again, trusting that, for once, the world could watch over him. In the chair beside them sat Samuel, dwarfed by the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. It was one of those standard hospital blankets, gray, thin, smelling faintly of bleach, but in his small frame, it looked like armor. His eyes were fixed on Max, not moving, not blinking too long, as though by watching the dog breathe, he could make sure life didn't forget them again. His hair stuck to his forehead in damp curls, and his face, streaked with old dust and new tears, looked too serious for a boy his age. Sheriff Nora Beckett stood by the window. Her reflection hovered beside the dark outside, two worlds divided by glass and regret. Lightning cracked across the horizon, carving the plains into white fire for half a heartbeat. Her uniform was still half soaked from the rain, hat resting on the counter beside her. She hadn't changed since bringing them in. The weight of command hung heavy on her shoulders, but heavier still was the silence, the kind that followed seeing something that reminded you of everything you've lost. The nurse, a young woman named Elena, entered quietly, carrying a tray with water and a cup of clear broth. Her sneakers made no sound against the linoleum. "He's stable," she said softly, meaning Officer Hayes, "but he'll need a transfusion by morning." She turned toward the boy, her voice warming. "You should drink too, sweetheart." She offered the cup. Samuel shook his head. His lips were cracked, but his voice was steady. "Max first." Elena blinked, unsure if she heard right, but when she followed his gaze, she saw the German shepherd stir at his name, nose twitching. The boy poured a little water into his palm, guiding it carefully toward the dog's muzzle. Max licked weakly, then sighed, head dropping back into sleep. The boy smiled faintly for the first time in hours. Nora turned from the window. The lightning threw her face into planes of shadow and light, cutting across the tired lines around her eyes. She knelt beside the chair, boots creaking, and studied the boy's single hand, small, trembling slightly, resting protectively near Max's paw. That missing arm, that wound against the world, somehow didn't make him look broken. It made him look chosen. For a long while she said nothing. The only sounds were the soft ticking of monitors, the whisper of rain, and the distant echo of thunder rolling through the Texas night. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of understanding that didn't need explanation. "You did good out there," she said quietly. "Most grown men would have run." Samuel didn't look up. "He didn't," he murmured, nodding toward Max. Nora felt something stir deep in her chest, part sorrow, part awe. There was a steadiness in this boy, a kind of faith that didn't make noise but didn't die either. The kind her father once called desert faith, the quiet endurance that kept people alive when reason had long since given up. Outside, the storm thickened. Rain slashed sideways across the parking lot, blurring the world into streaks of silver and gray. Thunder rolled low, steady as a drumbeat. The power flickered once, twice, before settling into a dim glow. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed softly at something, the sound faint and human. Nora rose slowly, her knees stiff, and crossed to the nurse's station. She found Tom Willis, a technician in his 40s, sitting before a glowing screen. His hair was slick with sweat despite the cold air conditioning, his fingers jittering over the keyboard. On the monitor, grainy dash-cam footage looped from Officer Hayes's cruiser, the last transmission before the radio went silent. The timestamp blinked. The camera jostled with motion, the sound of gravel under tires. Then, gunfire. A shout. The feed cut for a second, static, before flickering back to the image of a truck speeding away down the service road. "Pause that," Nora said. Tom froze the frame. The rain outside flashed in perfect time with the lightning that illuminated the footage. Just half a second of light, enough to carve the truth into view. A man's face caught mid-turn behind the wheel. Thin features, sunburned skin, eyes pale as glass, a cruel smirk frozen by chance. Nora leaned closer, the glow from the monitor painting her face in cold blue. "Zoom in." The name came to her lips before the tech even spoke it. "That's him," she whispered. "Mike Devon." Tom swallowed. "You know him?" "Yeah." Her voice was low, dangerous. "He used to run with a crew out of Midland. Robberies, transport hits. Thought he'd gone quiet." She straightened, every muscle in her body coiling tight beneath her soaked shirt. The thunder outside cracked again, louder this time, as if echoing her resolve. Back in the room, Samuel had dozed off, his small hand still resting on Max's fur. The dog's breathing was steady now, his dreams less restless. For a brief moment, peace lingered, a fragile, borrowed thing, but real enough to touch. Nora stepped into the doorway, her shadow falling across the boy and the dog. She watched them for a heartbeat, her face unreadable but her eyes fierce with purpose. Then, without looking away, she spoke, soft, almost a vow. "We'll finish this." The thunder answered her. The lights flickered once more, and somewhere beyond the storm, in the far reaches of the night, the man they called Mike Devon was still out there, smiling at the dark. Rain had not stopped since dusk. It fell in long, silver cords, hissing against the hood of every patrol truck that cut through the back roads toward the border. The land between Texas and Oklahoma was nothing but wet clay now. Red earth turned slick beneath the convoy's tires, swallowing the sound of engines until only the rhythmic sweep of wipers and the murmur of radios remained. In the lead vehicle sat Sheriff Nora Beckett, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon where the rain and fog seemed to fuse into one endless wall. Each flash of lightning revealed fragments of the path ahead, Barbed wire fences, flooded ditches, the skeletal outline of an old warehouse long abandoned by men, but not by sin. Beside her, in the passenger seat, Max sat upright. His coat, still patchy from healing scars, glistened under the dashboard light. He had refused to stay behind. The bandage around his hind leg was clean now, his breath steady, but his eyes, amber and unblinking, were full of something ancient. He was not restless. He was remembering. "Border in 4 minutes," came the voice of Deputy Royce over the radio. His tone was steady, but the static behind it betrayed the tension everyone felt. Nora didn't respond. She adjusted the shotgun resting between the seats, its barrel glinting faintly in the dim cabin light, then glanced once at Max. "Almost there," she murmured. The warehouse appeared out of the mist, like a ghost with iron ribs. Floodlights flickered on as the convoy spread out, beams slicing through the rain in pale arcs. Mud splashed beneath boots as officers fanned into position, their vests slick with water, radios whispering code words meant to make fear sound like order. Nora stepped down from the truck. The rain soaked through her uniform instantly, plastering it to her skin, but she didn't flinch. She gestured forward, 2 fingers raised, a signal to move in quiet. Max padded beside her, muscles coiled under the thin sheen of water running down his back. When they reached the door, Nora glanced once at the hinges. New, too new for an abandoned building. Someone had been here recently. She nodded. One officer pried the lock. The sound of metal giving way echoed into the hollow dark beyond. Inside, the air was thick, humid and sour with rot and fear. A single overhead bulb swung lazily, creaking with each gust of wind that slipped through the broken windows. And along the walls, like a nightmare made real, were cages, dozens of them. Rusted bars, soaked straw, and eyes, dozens of pairs, watching, unblinking, glinting faintly in the half-light. Dogs of every size and color huddled within, ribs pressing against skin, muzzles torn or wired shut. Some whimpered softly, others simply stared, as if hope had been trained out of them long ago. Max stopped. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The low rumble began deep in his chest, rolling upward until it filled the space like a warning older than words. His nose twitched once, twice, and then he looked toward the far end of the room. In the center, beneath the hanging light, stood Mike Devon. He looked older than the photo on the dash cam. Face lined, eyes colder, the smirk carved deeper into his skin. A black raincoat clung to his shoulders, and his left hand held a pistol like it was an extension of himself. Around him, the floor was littered with old chains, collars, betting slips, relics of the business he had built on blood. When he turned, he smiled like he'd been waiting. "Well, look at that," he drawled. "Thought you'd buried me, Sheriff." Nora didn't answer. The sound of rain dripping through the broken roof was the only reply. Her shotgun lowered, not as surrender, but as invitation. Max's growl deepened, and Devon's smile faltered. The dog stepped forward, head low, fur bristling, eyes locked on the man who had once taught animals to tear each other apart. The memory was scent before it was sight. Metal, smoke, cruelty. Recognition burned through him. Devon's voice cracked into a sneer. "That mud again? Guess some things just don't know when to die." He raised his pistol. The shot came fast, but fate had already shifted its weight. The bullet tore into the ceiling, shattering the single bulb, throwing the room into chaos. Sparks rained down like stars falling through smoke. Max lunged, the sound of his bark a thunderclap in the dark. Officers poured in behind, flashlights cutting the shadows into frantic fragments. Devon stumbled backward, firing again, wild and blind. Nora moved like instinct, low, forward, sure. The recoil from her shotgun cracked through the roar of rain and echoing barks. Devon hit the ground, weapons spinning away. The wind knocked from his lungs. In the strobe of lightning that followed, the truth of the place came alive. Dogs barking, cages rattling, chains snapping under bolt cutters, shouts of officers turning fear into rescue. "Get them out!" Nora shouted, her voice carrying above the storm. Deputies moved fast, unlocking cages, lifting trembling bodies into waiting arms. The floodlights outside swung as officers guided the freed animals into transport vans, voices breaking between relief and disbelief. Devon lay face down, wrists bound, mud soaking into his coat. He tried to curse, but the sound drowned in the chaos he'd created. Nora stood over him, breathing hard, rain streaking down her face, mixing with sweat and anger and the faintest trace of satisfaction. "It's over," she said. Her words weren't loud, but they carried farther than gunfire. Max limped to her side, panting, his fur slick with rain and grit. Nora knelt, pressing a hand against his head. For the first time since it began, she let her shoulders drop. "You did good, boy," she whispered. His tail thumped weakly against the ground, just once. Around them, the warehouse filled with new sounds. Water bowls clinking as officers poured fresh water, chains falling useless to the floor, soft cries of relief from men who had seen too much. The storm outside began to ease, thunder retreating into the distance like a tired god. Through a high window, a faint light crept in, gray, tentative, but real. Dawn was coming. Miles away, in a small hospital bed, Samuel stirred. His dream was full of light, breaking through clouds that had forgotten mercy. Somewhere in that dream, he smiled. And as the sirens faded into the new morning, the night exhaled, its long-held breath of justice finally released. The days that followed carried a stillness Dusty Creek hadn't felt in years. A quiet born not of emptiness, but of peace rediscovered. The desert no longer shimmered with danger. It shimmered with forgiveness. The courthouse square smelled of rain and coffee, and the sky, once a hard, merciless blue, had softened to the color of morning milk. The diner reopened its doors for the first time in months. Children biked through puddles by the church steps where someone had placed fresh white lilies. Even the wind had changed. It no longer hissed like judgment, but hummed like mercy, brushing against the windows as if to say the storm had done its work. Mike Devon was sentenced 3 days later. His smirk had disappeared when the judge read the verdict. Life without parole. His men scattered, their empire of cruelty dissolved into silence. Outside, Sheriff Nora Beckett stood on the courthouse steps as the rain began again, her hat in her hands, the silver star on her badge catching one brief flash of light before the clouds swallowed the sun. She didn't smile, but she exhaled, slow and long, like someone who had finally put the world back in balance. That evening, a gentle dusk wrapped around the plains, and far beyond the edge of town stood a weathered farmhouse with a porch that groaned under years of wind. Nora leaned on its rail, watching the fields darken to gold and gray. The smell of wet earth and mesquite rose from the ground. Behind her, the old screen door creaked as Callan Hayes stepped out, his limp faint but steady. He carried a mug of coffee for her, his hands still rough from work. Down by the fence, tools lay where he'd been mending boards earlier, his way of building life back piece by piece. Under the porch, Max rested in the shade, his fur brushed gold by the low sun. The scars along his flank had begun to fade, replaced by the quiet confidence of a creature who had known both violence and grace. His eyes followed every sound, but his tail wagged only when Samuel's voice rang across the yard. The boy ran barefoot through the wet grass, chasing a paper airplane that never quite found its way to the ground. He had been living there since the trial. Officially, it was temporary. Papers said so, forms said so, but everyone in Dusty Creek knew the truth. The boy had found a home, not in walls, but in rhythms. The creak of the porch under Nora's boots, the scrape of Hayes's hammer on wood, and the low bark of a dog who no longer had to fight to prove his worth. Mornings have come gentle now. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen windows. The old radio crackled with country music and distant weather reports. Max would circle the porch twice before lying under the same patch of shade, glancing toward the door until Samuel burst outside, laughter in his voice, shoes forgotten. Hayes would pretend to scold him, but even he couldn't hide the small smile that tugged at his tired face. Sometimes Nora paused, her work to watch them. Healing, she realized, didn't arrive like thunder. It came like dusk, quietly filling the empty spaces left behind by grief. She had spent years chasing orders, filing reports, counting arrests, believing law alone could hold a town together. But it was this: small acts of loyalty, a boy's laugh, a dog's steady heart, that cooled the world far better than justice ever could. At twilight, the air turned honey-colored, and the porch lights glowed like lanterns guiding lost travelers home. Hayes would look up from his mending to see Samuel sitting beside Max, the boy's small hand resting on the dog's back, his face calm and unafraid. It was a picture so simple it almost hurt to look at. A reminder that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it just stayed. One evening, Nora joined them, hands tucked in her coat pockets. "You're supposed to be asleep soon," she said, her voice roughened by too much night duty and too little rest. Samuel looked up with that same steady calm that had once stopped her breath in a hospital hallway. "The day's not tired yet," he said. Nora laughed, quietly, the way people laugh when they haven't in a long time. She tousled his hair and sat on the step beside him. Max lifted his head, eyes half closed, tail brushing her boot once in greeting. They stayed like that until the stars came out. 3 survivors sharing the same piece of silence, the same breath of peace. Night deepened. Rain began to fall again, soft against the tin roof, filling the house with the rhythm of renewal. Hayes banked the fire, Nora dimmed the lamps, and Max settled beside Samuel's bed, head resting near the boy's missing arm. The glow from the hallway spilled just enough to paint the room in warm amber. Nora lingered by the doorway. The sound of the rain steadied her pulse. Then she heard Samuel's whisper, barely a breath, yet clear enough to reach her. "We're all rescued by someone's mercy, one way or another." The words stopped her. They were hers once, spoken long ago in a moment of exhaustion, but hearing them now, returned in a child's voice, felt like prayer answered. She stayed there, hand on the doorframe, eyes closed, listening to the quiet grace of it. In the dark, Max stirred. His tail thumped once against the floor. A soft, deliberate sound, like an amen carried on wind. Outside, the desert breathed again. The soil drank the rain. The sky opened in patient silver, stars hanging low enough to touch. Dusty Creek slept without fear for the first time in a long while. And in that farmhouse, between a woman who found her peace, a boy who found his home, and a dog who remembered both. The world had finally learned how to grow gentle again. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They linger, soft as breath, steady as the heartbeat of those who gave more than they ever had to spare. In a small Texas town, a wounded officer, a loyal dog, and a boy who had every reason to stop believing found each other, and in doing so, reminded us what mercy can still do in this world. Loyalty isn't always loud. It's a dog waiting by the door. It's a hand reaching for another even when it trembles. It's the choice to care when the world says walk away. And maybe that's what courage really is. Not the noise of victory, but the quiet that follows after. When the dust has settled and someone decides to keep believing in good. So if tonight feels too heavy, look toward the small lights, the steady ones. Because somewhere, in a farmhouse, a patrol car, or a broken road still finding its way home, there's always someone keeping watch for the rest of us. If stories like this still touch your heart, stay with us, subscribe, and keep the light alive for the next one.